Well, ladies and gentlemen, everyone, good evening and welcome to this Wellbeing webinar on lifestyle and ageing. Are you ready for a healthy retirement? And of course, this is hosted by Wolper Jewish Hospital, Friends of Wolper and National Seniors Australia. My name's Julie McCrossin and it's my great pleasure to welcome you and to be your host this evening. And I am 67 and I would describe myself as probably partially retired and also a grandmother. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm broadcasting to you on Aboriginal land. I'm on the land of the Kaurna people in Adelaide, and I know that people will be joining us from across Sydney, but also a broader range of locations as well. So let's pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging. Our format tonight will be an audience poll, so we'll learn a little bit about you and then a lively panel discussion. And I'll tell you in a moment how you can ask questions. And our purpose, of course, is to share information really about how to give ourselves the best possible chance of a healthy and happy retirement. So some quick housekeeping. We can't see or hear you in the audience, but you can start asking questions right now via Q&A, which you'll be able to see there on the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in Q&A. Our question monitor is Dr. Alan Schell, GP and a great friend of Wolper. He will be looking at all the questions, and from time to time throughout the evening, I'll invite Alan onto screen and he'll bring some of your questions to our panel. Of course, we'll try and answer as many as possible, and we won't be able to answer them all, but we'll do our living best. And Alan is also able to see questions on Facebook. Remember that our webinar is recorded and it will be available on the Wolper Jewish Hospital website, and we'll let you know about that later. And we'll also send you a survey so we get your feedback on how we can do a better job in the future. So without any further chatting, I'd like to begin by inviting Dr. Alan Schell, GP, friend of Wolper, to open proceedings. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you and welcome to everybody. And I'd also like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal members, our national treasures, past, present and future. And welcome all our panellists. Wolper Hospital is actually celebrating, as you see in the background there, 60 years. And in some ways, if it's not going to retire, but certainly it's been through many of the community events that we've all gone through. We've not had a war or depression like many of our parents did, but we have had October and the Wall Street collapsing and changes in the environment, which is a big topic for the moment. But most importantly, a lot of the things are affecting our health and our wealth, and part of that will be the discussion tonight. And I think that people should just know a little bit about Wolper. We've been presenting the Wellbeing programs for well over 18 years. I've been part of that, and I appreciate your coming here tonight. We've become a premier facility in the eastern suburbs and in Sydney in rehabilitation for things such as hips and knees, and in improving people's health outcomes after medical incidents, and certainly assisting people with palliative care. So we're part of the community, and part of that is to help educate you, our audience, in a better understanding of your health and in this case, and your welfare. So I'd like to introduce Chris Greiss, who's the General Manager of National Seniors Australia, who is one of our partners tonight. And I'm happy to say when you look up their website, it says that you can become a senior if you've turned 60 or more. So Wolper has just made it. So thank you, Chris. And for those that are interested, I'm sure he'll talk about senior cards and all those other things. So over to you, Chris, and then we'll come back to Julie. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. And I'm coming to you from Brisbane, or the traditional lands of the Turrbal people. So firstly, to thank the Wolper Jewish Hospital and the Friends of Wolper for the opportunity to get everybody together. And I guess that from National Seniors perspective, our organisation is about advancing the well-being of all older Australians. And you're never too young to be involved and engaged in this organisation, because it's something in which that the earlier that you embrace later life and retirement and can plan for it, that means that you have much better health outcomes.
And we're finding that whether it's to do with digital literacy, whether it's around mobility, and even if, though for those of us in the audience who are still driving, it's about, getting the newest car you possibly can with the safety devices to keep you safe. Whether it's aging in place, it's making sure that you prepare in advance, because when something happens at home, it happens pretty quickly. So if you're able to put sort of some mild modifications into your home, it's about preparing for the future, and I suppose controlling your environment, and even finances play a big role. So I guess information sessions like this are incredibly important, because it's about sharing knowledge, it's demystifying what's out there and is available. And I know that from our organisation's perspective, we just pulled together a concessions calculator. And with that, we've sought to bring together so many things that are from local council, state government, and even from a federal perspective, concessions, discounts, offers, and I suppose benefits and rights that you have as older Australians that are available to you, but quite often and unfortunately, they're the best kept secret. So I'd encourage you to go to our website, nationalseniors.com.au, or give us a call on 1300 76 50 50 and talk to our people that want to help and support you. And we've been very lucky and fortunate in what is COVID's been a difficult time, that community has been the real win out of this event, and the capacity for people to actually come together as a group, whether it's by video, in person where they're able to, or even just through over the phone conversations. Incredibly important. So I thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to hearing from our esteemed, my esteemed co-presenters, and you will incredibly enjoy this evening. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to Wolper and to you, Alan, and great job, Julie. Looking forward to it. Thanks heaps.
Thank you very much, Chris. And as everybody, please think about National Seniors. I certainly do. Without further ado, I'll hand us back to Julie, who's our wonderful moderator, compere and questionnaire. So thank you, Julie, and I shall now go on mute.
Yes, thank you very much, Alan, and welcome to those of you who've joined us. We're talking about how to have the best chance of a happy and healthy retirement. We're just going to do an audience poll, but just a reminder before we go to that you can ask questions now through the Q&A button down below, and Dr. Alan Schell will be monitoring those and will bring questions throughout the evening to our panel members. So just put your questions in the Q&A button down below, and we'll come to you shortly. Just before we meet our panel, we've got a quick set of poll questions. I'll read the question and then I'll read the answer, and this enables our panel to learn a little bit about you, the audience. So I'll ask Michael, our technical Zoom aficionado, to put up question 1 for our poll on the screen. Thank you. This is about your plans. Are you currently, and only one answer please, retired, planning your retirement, not planning on retiring yet, would like to retire but not in a position to do so? Please tick the box most relevant to you. Thanks, Michael. Let's have a look at our results, please. So 67% of our audience are retired, 11% are planning, 13% are not planning on retiring yet, and 9% would like to retire but are not in a position to do so. Let's go to our second question, please. This is about health and wealth. When planning your retirement, did you spend as much time thinking about your health as your wealth? So this is for people who have already retired, but if you're in that planning stage, are you spending as much time thinking about your health as your wealth? More about wealth, more about health, about the same. Single choice, please. And the answers, thanks, Michael. 26% have thought more about wealth, 24% more about health, 50% about the same. Thank you. Our next question, please. Social needs. And I've defined social needs as things like volunteering, joining clubs, learning new skills, planning to spend more time with family. So when planning your retirement, did you spend as much time thinking about your social needs, your human connections, as your wealth? A single choice, please. And the answer, thanks? 20% more about wealth, 40% more about social needs, 39% about the same. Thank you. Our next question. Wellbeing. Do most retirees that you know have a positive wellbeing associated with? And please click on the ones that you think most of the retirees you know are positive about. Wealth, health, social needs, emotional needs, all of the above. And the answers, please. So 17% positive about wealth, 17% positive wellbeing about health, 22% positive wellbeing about social needs, 7% emotional needs, and 75% all of the above. Thank you. We have one final question, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone. Age range, your age, please, a single choice, up to 40 years old, 41 to 50, 51 to 60, 61 to 70, 71 to 80, 81 or over. And the answers, please. So we've got nobody under 40, 1% under between 41 and 50, 5% 51 to 60, 26% 61 to 70, 49% 71 to 80, and 19% 81 years and older. Look, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. That was very, very helpful to all of us, I'm sure, and to our panel in particular. It's my great pleasure now to welcome to join me on screen our four panel members. John Piggott AO, Scientia Professor John Piggott AO, Professor Joanne Earl, Associate Professor Melody Ding, and Professor Stephen Leeder AO. And you can all call me Professor Julie for the course for the rest of the evening, if that's all right. And a big welcome to you. This is deaf sign clapping. If you could clap and welcome each other. And I think Stephen Leeder is just joining us now. Stephen, if you were able to turn on your camera so that we could see you. I'm going to come, if I may, first to Professor John Piggott. Thank you. Welcome, Stephen. And I'll introduce each person in more detail as I bring them on. John Piggott AO is a Professor of Economics at the University of New South Wales, Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence in Population, Ageing and Research. And he's become golden due to a technical issue with his computer. Should you become more golden during the evening, we will only enjoy it. Well, you know, John, I guess I'll begin by, you talk about a retirement window and that you think it's really important for people to realise there's an incredible range of circumstances in which people find themselves. Can you explain what you mean by that and why that's so significant?
Well, I think perhaps the most important decision people can make in approaching retirement is when actually to retire. And often when people seek advice or guidance about this, they don't seek the advice or guidance until after they've retired. And they say, oh, no, I'm retired, so I better find out what to do next. But actually, one of the biggest options they had, how long to work, that's gone by now. That's no longer an option for them. I think it's important to appreciate the enormous range of circumstances in which people in this retirement window find themselves, because work is an extremely important part of life. And you reach a mature age for some people, right, where work is important and fulfilling and people want to keep on doing it. And for others, they've had enough. And that's going to make a huge difference to the way in which they approach this question of when to detach from the labour force.
Can I ask you, because I want to get your thoughts on how to go about the timing and the transition. But I'm also interested in what retirement means in the 21st century, because as I said, I'm 67, many of my friends are in their 70s, and I see a pattern of part-time work, a sort of, I'd call it a slow lowering, but a maintenance of work that often extends well into the 70s. So I'm just wondering, has how we think about retirement changed in recent years because of changes in the nature of work itself?
Well, I think partly changes in the nature of work. I think partly changes in the nature of retirement provision. So now we have not just the age pension, but we also have superannuation, and that's becoming quite significant for quite a few people. And some of those people who enjoy their working life will think, well, I can work an extra year or two and accumulate some more. And then they might think, well, I can do some of that and actually enjoy my life, my leisure life, maybe test retirement. Retirement is quite scary to a lot of people, it's scary to me. And I think testing it by partial withdrawal, a transition to retirement, makes a lot of sense. Now, it's not always possible, but it's increasingly becoming possible. And I think that's because more and more people are mature workers, and business is recognizing that mature workers, there's an awful lot of them, and they're extremely valuable. And so you're beginning to get to this point where business is making some adjustments to try to retain, in some capacity, right, workers at an older age than previously. The other point to make, I think, is that people are much healthier than they were. So it used to be the case that you get to 65 and you just about make the age pension, right? And then you'd be not that well, right? But now people stay healthy well into their 70s, into their 80s. And so for those who enjoy work, they can continue to work and they're not handicapped by a deteriorating health profile.
I'm going to come back to you for more discussion about the nature of the Australian safety net and how it compares internationally on the economic side. But you mentioned there that it scares you, retirement. Do you mind telling us how old you are and what you're scared about?
No, I'm 74. I've just turned 74. I work full time, and I work pretty actively full time to the extent one can with COVID. I think what happens if you pursue a long career and enjoy it and become engrossed within it is that a lot of your social needs are in fact met professionally. And then there is this sudden disjunction, right, where you are moved away from that workforce culture that you've enjoyed. And then what? Well, there's family, if you're fortunate. I'm fortunate, there's family. But probably there isn't the network of social connections independent of one's work experience that someone with a different kind of career structure and a different kind of workforce attachment, perhaps someone who's been in and out of the labour force throughout their lives, might have.
Yes, and thank you so much. And I want to let our audience know, and questions are welcome in the Q&A, that we are going to be hearing from people who do see retirement as a landmark moment and an opportunity for in a sense, an improvement of one's health and well-being. But I don't want to leave the psychological concerns too quickly. And I want to welcome, if I may, Professor Stephen Leeder, to join the conversation. And Professor Stephen Leeder, AO, is Emeritus Professor of Public Health and Community Medicine at the University of Sydney, very involved with the Menzies Centre. But I think Stephen, you would describe him as a leading Australian intellectual on the health scene. If you could turn on your mic, Stephen. Stephen has written an article when he retired this year, and it's called "Welcome to God's Waiting Room, a leading doctor reflects on retirement." And I want to read just a segment from it, Stephen, and ask you to, I guess, comment on it. And you've said, retirement is a big deal. It is a life event. It perturbs the organism. It strips us of our identity. It cancels our power and influence. Yesterday's rooster, excuse the sexism, has become today's feather duster. How long have you been retired now?
I've been retired, Julie, since June of last year, June the 30th. That was so that I could fix the finances and tether them to the financial year. Yes, it is a big deal. I think, John, I agree totally with what John has described. There's a lot of loss in retirement, I think, for most people. And that loss includes social networks, it includes power. If you've been in a managerial or administrative position, leadership position, and that carries with it a psychological freight. And one needs to be ready for that, or as ready as we can be. But it is a major point of transition.
You know, I'm very mindful that I think from memory, and your memories will help me on this, about 50% of our audience listening tonight are indeed already retired. And I want to incorporate that into our thinking, both in terms of when we talk about the value of work. Can we move from retirement to other types of work should we feel we wish to not be fully retired, and so on? But if I could stay with this psychological, Stephen, do you think men may feel this more than women, or it would not be gendered?
Well, it depends who you ask, of course. The attachment that men have to work as an expression of life fulfillment is quite strong, as been described many times. And the capacity for the formation of social networks is often weaker than it is for women. I mean, I'm not wanting to make a big deal of this, but there are differences there that are important, yes.
Is there anything, if someone's listening to this and they haven't retired yet, is there any, upon reflection now with that little bit of experience, are there things that you wish you had done more of in the last, say, 5 years before retirement?
Not really, no. I had an opportunity, rather as John described, to attenuate my commitment in work. I had no major managerial responsibility in the last 3 years, although I'd been Dean of a medical faculty and chair of a local health district board and a whole bunch of other things. So I was progressively moving from those responsibilities into a freer environment during the last years. I had the opportunity, not just in the last year, but the last 20 years really, of engaging with a group of poets, and I've enjoyed that immensely. And that's provided another string in my bow, as it were. Should I or would I have devoted more time or energy to that? I don't know. But I think it is very important to sort of diversify your portfolio of interests before you hear the bathwater rushing down the drain, so to speak. If you can. And I think the points that John made about the diversity of experience of retirement are really critical, because for some people, retirement is enormous relief. For others, it's devastating. And in between, probably most of us who experience a bit of those different things. But we need to be empathetic to a variety of experiences.
Look, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you, being so frank. Where did you write that article for? Can you just remind me where it was published?
It was published in a medical newspaper called Australian Doctor or Medical Observer. I'm never sure which one it is, but
yes, Medical Observer. No, that's interesting. Yes, I really appreciate your frankness. Look, I'd like to welcome in, if I may, Associate Professor Melody Ding, who's an epidemiologist and population behaviour scientist at the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, and you were the lead researcher in a major study of 25,000 older Australians. Could we just give some deaf sign clapping, first of all, to John Piggott and Stephen Leeder for kicking us off, and also to welcome Melody to us. Melody, just before I ask your question, your reflections on what you've just been hearing, because I know you describe retirement as a window of opportunity, but of course, just tell us how old you are. I think it's critical in this conversation.
I'm 37.
Not 37, so
just a couple of years younger.
But just before I ask your question, your reflections on what you've heard so far.
I absolutely love and agree with everything that I've heard from the start to just now. And I think I pretty much agree with all of these, both personally and professionally.
Because I'm thinking, I think both the gentlemen who've spoken so far are lucky enough to have jobs that they deeply like, where they feel they've made a difference and continue to shape the society in positive and constructive ways. And so it's great to hear someone talk frankly, I think, of the grief. But tell us about a window of opportunity, a landmark event. What do you mean?
Yeah, so there is this concept called lifespan approach that is becoming more and more popular in epidemiology. Basically, the idea is that things that happen in our life, the accumulation of things from the start to the end that shapes our health outcomes. And in that, major transitions like retirement, marriage, having children, all of that contributes to our health outcomes. And I took a particular interest in retirement because of my parents going through retirement at that time. So it was very interesting when I start to get my hands on the data. So basically, when you follow a group of Australians from New South Wales for about 25,000 of them for a couple of years, some of them retired, others didn't. And when we account for, all the other differences like age and sex and other aspects, this gives us a natural comparison between the two. And what we found was that those who retired were more likely to change their lifestyle for the healthier, particularly in terms of being more physically active, sitting less, sleeping more, and for women, also more likely to quit smoking if they were smokers to start with. So, and then, of course, during the process, I was reading a lot of literature from, Australia and overseas, and that seems to be quite a common finding, the window of opportunities, because of various reasons. For example, work really takes a large chunk of our time, at least 1/3 of them, at least half of our waking time. So all of a sudden we have a lot more time at our disposal that we can, harness towards healthier activities. For example, our social network changes. Maybe now we have more time to actually spend with the social network of our choice. And also, even though work means different things for different people, there's quite a substantial proportion of the population consider work stressful. So retirement means removal from that stressor. And also there's this theory of, like the window of opportunity for change where you rethink about your lifestyle. So when a critical moment happens in your life, whether that's marriage, whether that's being parents, whether that's being empty nester or retirement, that often prompts you to rethink about, what do I want to do with your life? What do I want to get out of, the remaining part of my life, rather than just kind of living every day for another day and worry about change in the future.
And Melody, I understand that a key factor was whether people were able to choose the timing of their retirement, or whether it was forced retirement. Could you just tell us that?
Yeah, because for the participants, they had the choices of, choosing for what reason they retired. And there's many reasons that we collapse into two major categories. So we call them the voluntary versus involuntary. And what we found was that for voluntary retirement, this health effect was very pronounced. But for involuntary retirement, there was either no effect or sometimes even negative effects on their health. So I think, both John and Stephen had touched on it already in terms of kind of thinking about planning for that that moment happen rather than just waking up and realize that I'm not working anymore. And I think that really makes a huge difference there.
I'm going to come to questions shortly. And before I come to you, Professor Joanne Earl, if you don't mind, just to hear a little bit from our audience. But before I do, you also found that in terms of a happy, healthy retirement, this is what we're aiming for or encouraging if possible, that a sense of meaning and purpose is crucial. And you mentioned you have an 89-year-old neighbour who's come to embody for you perhaps what you hope for yourself. But so tell us about meaning and purpose, and then tell us about your neighbour, whom I'm hoping you love in the cultural spirit of our nation.
Yes, meaning and purpose is extremely important. That's what help us get out of the bed every morning, which I think is, all of us live for. And unfortunately, if we don't cultivate that, if we don't think about that outside of our work, that sense of loss after retirement, or even sense of grief for some people, because all of a sudden, if everything is surrounding work prior to retirement, that could really be a sense of loss for people. So therefore, it's really important for us to find another anchor. So it's really lovely to hear, from Stephen, for example, in terms of poetry. And I think that is a perfect example of, another meaning of purpose outside of work that, could just get you going and enjoy life every day.
And I'll come back to you later for the significance of socioeconomic background and level of education, but just tell me about your neighbour.
Oh, my neighbour. Yes, I have a legendary neighbour and I adore her very much. She lives in the same building with me. She's 89-year-old. Her husband passed away a couple of years ago, so she's been living on her own the entire time. But she really embodies, the best living for me. She's extremely active. She takes her walk. She lives in eastern suburb as well. And she takes her walk. She loves her flowers and plants. She feeds the birds. She speaks to neighbors. She speaks to birds and, all the animals that can visit her. And she is a dancer and she still dances. She's been doing ballroom dancing all her life. And apparently before COVID, she was teaching seniors much younger than she is dancing. And she's still volunteering through Salvation Army. She often talked to me about how much that means to her to help people who are in need, and then the smiles that she brings on people's faces. And when she talked to me about all of that, I just see her eyes sparkle and I can see her keep on going, for another 10, 15 years. And she's extremely independent. And despite some medical challenges, she still drives quite safely and walks up and down stairs on her own. So I thought that, I want to be like that when I'm her age.
And can I look, thank you so much, Melody. Can you give them the deaf sign clapping thing, ladies and gentlemen? But just before I go to questions, Professor Joanne Earl, I'll bring you in for one quick question. Professor Joanne Earl is a registered psychologist, Department of Psychology, Macquarie University, Centre for Ageing, Cognition and Wellbeing. And I think you have been and still are a member of the New South Wales Ministerial Advisory Council on Ageing. Just one quick question and I'll come back. The neighbour that Melody described, is that just about personality and temperament? It's got absolutely nothing to do with ageing. That if we'd met her at 25, she would have been dancing and singing and talking to birds and neighbours.
Well, I think, yeah, sure. Some of those things will be fairly stable across the lifespan. So personality, for example, remains fairly stable. But I also think that what Melody illustrates in that story is this sort of sense of continuity, something like dancing, for example, that maybe she's done throughout her whole life. And in the same way that Stephen spoke about poetry, in some ways when we're talking about exiting a career, then maybe there's an opportunity to create different types of continuity and different types of network before you leave work. So engaging more generally with other people and activities prior to retirement, and not thinking about retirement as a one-off event. You know, it's not the gold watch and 25 years service anymore. It's a process and takes place over time.
Look, can you help me as a Brains Trust panel, help me to return to this question of motivation and behavioural change? Because obviously we're going to fill the screen with advice, you know, about steps to take. But there's knowing and then there's doing. And I'd love some reflections on that. But look, I might, if I may, invite Dr. Alan Schell, our question moderator and GP, to join us and bring us a couple of the questions from our audience. Welcome back, Alan.
Thank you. Somebody pointed out it was Chancellor Otto von Bismarck who originally thought that people should retire at 70. And then in 1916, the German government then decided that 65 would be the retiring age. And we've kept that number until recently, when it's got up to 67. So in fact, it's been a whole century or more that people assume that, you know, you retire at 65, get pension, etc. And I also note that we're living in our third age, aren't we? Because we've had the youth to getting our degrees, to getting our jobs and then working, and now we're in the third age. And as somebody pointed out, should we take up language, studying music or art as some way to stop ourselves aging and enjoy retirement? And looking at the numbers, we had 67% of the community who voted here were retired, but we still have 1/3 who are thinking about retiring or not yet retiring. So with that, a big question was, why do some people retire and then endure poor health and get sick? And I think Melody sort of alluded to that one. And I think that we also have to then think, well, I'm getting older. Should I consider moving to a retirement village? So the two things really all got to do with health and wealth. Okay.
Look, thank you. I'll pause you there if I may. Can I come to Stephen Leeder? As a professor of community medicine, I have to come to you in relation to the first question. Alan, just repeat that first question for us. Just do them one at a time, if you would.
Yes, is learning a new language or studying music postpone aging? And when should I move to a retirement village?
What are your thoughts? If you could, you've got your mic on, yeah.
Yep. Well, Melody probably has more database answer available on this one than I do, but there's no question that those other activities open up all sorts of psychological and social possibilities. If you're learning another language, if you're learning it with a group of people, you form friendships, relationships, and the rest of it, all of which are strongly associated with solid self-esteem and frequently with good health. Though where the chicken and the egg begin and finish here is a hard one, because if you're not very well, you don't feel like doing a great deal. So, I mean, going for a 4-kilometre walk in the morning, 7 o'clock's a great idea, but if you've got crooked knees or hips or heart failure, you're not likely to want to do it. So you know, there's a sort of a nexus there, an association, but it's not necessarily causal. When to go into a retirement village? Well, people have very strong views, pro and con. I know what mine is. Mine would be never. But that's being flippant, and it is a serious consideration. And it depends not only on the health and well-being of the individual, but their family circumstances and social setting and their degree of capacity to afford it. So it's a complex decision.
It is. I'll come back to your feelings about that in a second. I come to you, John Piggott, and I'm coming to you, I guess, particularly on this question of decisions about where to live and how to plan for that. because there's a very strong socioeconomic element to that, isn't there? So this question of, when should one decide to consider a retirement village, which I guess is a housing question, isn't it, about what sort of housing you want? What are your thoughts? How do you respond to a question like that?
I suppose there are a couple of things. So one of the things the data show is that people tend to make decisions about moving when there is a major life event like a spouse dying, right? So you hang on to your owner-occupied home, you hang on to your principal residence, and there are all sorts of incentives to do that. Some of them are financial, some of them are networking, right? Your community. Sometimes it's quite difficult to move within a community. But when your spouse dies, then the house becomes too much to manage, right? The whole question of costs and benefits changes, the balance changes, and that's often the time when people move. And of course, one possibility in that transition would be to move into something where there's a bit more support, and a retirement village may well provide that. So I think that's often what happens. So that would be one observation I would have. Just anecdotally, I think moving out of an environment where you have a strong social network is high risk. That would be my own personal assessment. And so I wouldn't wish to do that. I would want to stay where I have a social network already established.
In my experience, the reason for a sudden move can also be a fall. Falls are an amazing...
particularly into an aged care facility.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And I just come to this issue because as I understand it, Professor Piggott, you believe that one of the really big current challenges facing older people, and so it's linked to retirement planning, is this concern about the quality and safety of aged care.
Yeah.
Going to
I think there are a lot of pieces to that, right? Mm-hmm. So the first piece is denial, right? There's this line in the movie, I forget which movie now, right? Never underestimate the power of denial. And everyone in their 60s, right, denies that they will end up in a nursing home or in a residential aged care facility. So I think that's very common. And that means that consideration isn't really given to that, either by the individual themselves or by their families. So aged care decisions are made in the hospital car park, right, is a line that often comes up, often emerges in this context. So denial is, so I think that's one thing. We don't want to face it. But as well as that, if you think about, maybe I can just broaden this a little, Julie. If you think about the way in which we support older people in Australia, we do very well with incomes. At the moment, I think this may change. Some may change significantly. We do very well with most older people having housing security of one kind or another. Not everyone, but at the moment, most people. And that combination, that age pension and bit of superannuation and principal residence that you're living in, or alternatively, housing security, perhaps with a child or something of that kind, that sort of gets you out of poverty. And then we have healthcare, which is universal, and I think we have a good healthcare system on the whole. So if you look internationally across OECD countries, I think we do that kind of thing pretty well and pretty equitably. Then you come to aged care, and we don't do quite so well, as the last few years have surely documented. And we need to do much better with that. What that means, though, is that if you are in your 60s, then you've got this sense of insecurity, what an economist might call an uninsurable risk. There are things that might happen that you're really not covered for. And of course, one of them is ending up in an aged care facility. And so you hang on to your wealth, you underconsume. So the pattern that you observe is people undersave through working life, and that's why we have mandated saving to make up for that sum. When it gets to retirement, you underconsume. And that means that you don't enjoy life as much as you might, because you're nervous about what might happen.
I'd like to bring in Professor Joanne Earl, if I may, and then I'll come back for another question, Alan. And the reason I'm bringing you in, Joanne, is that you believe that if you take a very considered approach about when to leave work, and then you plan holistically for retirement, it is possible to achieve a healthy and happy retirement. And I'm just wondering, as you're listening to this, what do you still feel confident about that? And I know that you divided into a series of areas, but the first priority areas are wealth, health, and social planning. So how do you respond to a question like, when should I go into a retirement village?
Yeah.
Well, in the context of your views about planning.
Sure. Well, I can talk about that in the context of some research I've done, but also my experience on New South Wales Ministerial Advisory Council of Ageing, where housing is one of the issues that we're talking about almost every meeting. And I guess there's a couple of different observations there. I think from my perspective, a lot of people want to age in place. And that doesn't even necessarily mean their own home, but there's the same community where their social networks are set up. And so sometimes that isn't possible. And so the type of housing that they're living in might determine whether or not they move or not. So for example, a house with many stairs, or, you know, that's difficult to access to get up and down. So all of those things will determine whether or not people stay in their house for longer. But I do think that if people start planning, you know, in advance, then they can think about these different types of resources, those 6 buckets of resources. And the top 3 ones you've just mentioned in terms of health, wealth, and social. Getting those right is a big contributor to the overall adjustment that people will experience.
And in your experience, because I think you've done some research on this as well, what factors predict a positive adjustment to retirement? What have you found there? Yeah,
sure. So as Melody was talking about, workplace exit is a big one. So having a say about how and when you leave work are some of the things that matter. Also, income does matter. It's a good predictor of adjustment. Health, in terms of the model that we've just described. Being married or having a relationship where people have got good social support. The longer that people are retired, the better adjusted they seem to be. So there might be a difficult period at the beginning, and then over time, people seem to settle into that and enjoy it more. So older people tend to report higher levels of adjustment than younger people necessarily do. And it's a little bit mixed in terms of gender as well with women. So, you know, there's not as clear a picture about retirement adjustment for women, often because they find themselves in caring roles for either children, spouses, or parents, and unexpectedly so. And that may force them to have to leave work, a job that they enjoyed, for example. So there's this sense of loss from having to leave a career and then take on the caring responsibilities that maybe, you know, don't fulfill the same needs for them that work did.
Melody, just quickly from you before I come back to Alan, is there anything in your research that goes to this question of choosing a retirement village or not as a lifestyle choice?
Unfortunately, I have not researched on that topic. Yeah.
Okay, well, don't you worry about that. Alan, can I come back to you for another question, please?
Yeah, so I did miss one. Is why do some people retire and then endure poor health or get sick? And therefore, what are some of the mental health resources that may help somebody into retirement? Or, as you say, being retired for a while, what are some of the support services to stop them getting sick, if you can say that? So you retire and then get sick. It often happens, and I certainly had that with a neighbour. Yeah.
Joanne, your response?
Yeah, sure. I hear this often, you know, that stories about people that they knew that retired and then dropped off the perch. And I don't know if maybe one of the reasons why they retired and they left it a little bit too long, that there was already ill health there, and they just delayed it until the point where it forced them out of the workforce. So that's one potential thing. I think it varies tremendously depending upon occupation. You know, it's very unusual to find a 78-year-old bricklayer, but not unusual to find a 78-year-old academic, for example. So, you know, I think that the role that people do depends a lot on when and how they leave work. I think the question that John raised about, you know, work centrality being really important, that can be one of the things that predicts retirement adjustment from a psychological perspective. So coming to terms with how and when you want to leave work, as Melody was talking about, I think it's underestimated. The consequences are underestimated. And so one of the things that we're doing in our current research is we're providing career advice, doing online career modules and then career advice for people before they go on to get financial advice. And also they get health advice along the way. And the reason we've done that is because if people haven't really adjusted to the idea of a different type of lifestyle, then it can be much more difficult to adjust to. So we're trying to deal with the problem by preventing it rather than curing it after the event. We think we can prevent it by getting people to take a much more considered approach to how and when they leave work. But if people do need assistance, you know, from a psychological perspective, and they're feeling depressed or anxious, there are 3 key things that they can do. The first thing would be to see your local GP, because you may need a mental health care plan, and that will help give you access to psychological resources. Secondly, if you wanted to just get online and have a conversation with someone or see what resources are available, there are some excellent resources on the Beyond Blue website. So I would recommend that people do that. And then thirdly, if people want to see a psychologist and they didn't want to go through their doctors, they can go to the Australian Psychological Society website and they can search for a psychologist in their area with different descriptions of the people that they normally see, for what sort of problems they normally have, and then make an educated decision there.
Look, thank you so much. Alan, can we have another question?
Yes, so it's a mixed question, because can you give advice on retirement planning for a single person? So in other words, with Joanne saying often it's better where there are couples because they have a better social support and network. When we talk about retirement planning, we're talking about here health, wealth, and social. So I think that it's a very good question. Retirement planning, we have 1/3 of the people who haven't retired yet. So we do have an audience who would like to listen. What are some of the things that one should do, and who could we go and seek other than the ones that perhaps Joanne has just mentioned?
Look, thank you. Can I come to you, John Piggott, first in terms of the financial planning and what difference it makes if you're single or not? Because we haven't mentioned a great deal yet the significance of our educational background, excuse me, and our socioeconomic circumstances, but they are very significant, aren't they? Even in a question like if you're considering a retirement village, the nature of the housing and community you may be able to join. So your thoughts if someone is single in terms of the financial wealth management planning, does it make a difference?
Oh yeah, yes, it makes a big difference. And for a start, you tend to be less diversified, right? So retirement doesn't necessarily happen together for both members of a relationship. And one can retire and that person can get used to retirement while the other is still working. And the one who's still working is probably providing some derivative social support for the one who's retired. So there's a lot going on when there's a couple. When there's a single person, it's much more all or nothing, unless you can organize to gradually retire. So that really matters. And then financially, it's not true that 2 people can live as cheaply as one, but they can certainly live for less than twice the price of one. And so if you're single, you really need more in terms of assets and in terms of potential income that you might have after you've exhausted your earnings capacity than would be the case if you were a member of a married couple, to enjoy the same standard of living, sort of commensurate standard of living. So in both those ways. But I'd like to just add something. I know I'm not a psychologist, but I'd like to just add something about single people retiring and where they might go non-financially. And it seems to me absolutely critical in this is to retain or transform one's thinking about a sense of purpose. So what seems to me to be missing so much when people retire and they find that they are unhappy is that they lack purpose. And I think that's a little bit more challenging for a single person often, because it may be that they don't have family that's close to them and so forth. So that makes this I don't want to say a search for purpose, but this establishment of a framework where purposeful living can take place. I think that becomes actually a quite important consideration. I think that's very important as people get older.
Can I ask you to comment on that, Stephen?
John's pointed out the complexity of what I'd call these existential concerns, and I think they are very real and probably confront the majority of people who retire, who look forward and say, well, this is my last step to where? And it's a fair question to ask. I don't know to what extent one can prefigure that question and develop a structure that's supportive, unless you are a person of religious faith, for example, and you probably find the answers that are satisfying within the structure of your religious group. But for many people these days, that's not an asset that's accessible to them. So they face the kind of questions that that follow from realising that you're retiring at whatever age, whether it's 70 or 80, that most of your life's behind you and there's not a great deal in front of you, and then what? Yeah. And these questions might yield to sensible, rational answers during the day, but if my experience is any indication, at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, yeah, they take on a different form altogether. Mm. And just a point of personal reflection, when I retired, I went to see my general practitioner, who's a very sagacious individual, and we had a chat, and he said to me, "You need a mental health plan," which surprised me a little. But I've found my contacts with the clinical psychologist in coming to terms with some of the realities of my retirement extremely helpful. He happens to be a devotee of Stoic philosophy, which is much more complicated than anything I'd appreciated before, but it has to do with the acceptance of things that you can't change and the pursuit of creative activities where you can make a contribution and where some of these larger questions can be answered. But my general practitioner was right. I found great benefit from that. And we weren't in the era of exploring psychosis or anything like that. This was straightforward counselling with regard to adjustment to loss, bereavement, and the angst of peering down the time channel to a point where it all ends.
Yes. Look, again, Stephen, thank you so much for speaking so openly about that, because mental health challenges in older people is a very significant issue. Alan, could I come to you as a general practitioner at this point rather than as a question moderator? But this issue of the GP as a referral point to counselling or support that Stephen's put on the table there, that's a critical issue, isn't it, for anyone who's listening who is struggling a bit with retirement?
Yes, and I think that, as I have done, you need to have a younger GP, because often you've grown older with your older GP and they may have retired. And so in some cases, and obviously the system, as John has said, has improved for all of us. And as Joanne has highlighted, there's the mental health care plan, because you will have to come to terms with a change in your career. As I've moved into academia and people still think that I know something. So we're happy to disseminate that information gladly. do community work, but there's a point where one has to consider retirement. And of course, as a professional person, it will come to you for advice. But I think, as Stephen has said, and as Joanne has said, you need to often seek someone else's assistance in finding that advice for you. As somebody actually said, they're quite content to be retired and have little contact with their friends. Is that a problem? Well, what I'd say that it's been shown that maintaining social support and social integration is probably very important for you to age well. But for other people, they might find that peaceful, content, quiet is something that they want. So again, you might find that talking to your GP in a reasonable sense, as Stephen has said, will benefit you, and then think, well, you know, do I need some help? Nothing wrong with talking to somebody who's independent and can listen to your story and help you make that decision, in fact.
Joanne, if I could come back to you for a moment, because, you know, there was the question about the person who was single, and I think it's important to say not all families are happy, not all couples are happy. And so retirement as a landmark event, as it's been referred to, can be a moment, I would imagine, I don't know if anyone in the group has data on this, but it can be a moment when couples can discover they've got grave difficulties, and separations can occur even at that stage.
Look, that's true. And there's been a lot of talk in the media about, you know, this tsunami of grey divorce. But I've had a look at the data on that, and it's not as prevalent as you might think. It may change over time as we see a lot of dual career couples retiring simultaneously, who maybe the longest period of time that they've spent together at that point has been on, you know, a 6-week holiday. And it's easy to love someone when you're on a cruise, or when you're, you know, sipping Mai Tais on the beach for 6 weeks. But it might be quite a different thing when, you know, you've got to get fences repaired or go shopping together or do the tax return. So I think that there's probably a bit of a balance in there. But, you know, people's relationships will change for all sorts of different reasons, even when children come into the picture, when they're buying a house for the first time. So as part of that transition, if people need assistance, you know, they can see marriage counsellors. Relationships Australia, for example, one of those groups that helps people to, you know, work their way through that and have those conversations. But the whole idea of, you know, grey divorce is not as common as you think. It tends to still be people in their 40s.
Can I come to you on your list of resources? Because we've talked about wealth, health and social.
Yeah.
The two other three are cognitive, emotional and motivational. Just concisely, can you tell us the significance of those three words?
Yeah, sure. So those three things, this is part of those buckets of resources that we talked about before. And as the resources go up and down, so does retirement adjustment. So keeping resources, you know, current in those three areas are really important. So in terms of cognition, we're talking about having, you know, the ability to be able to make decisions, integrate information, solve problems, and keeping active cognitively is important. Learning languages, exposing yourself to new ideas and people and having conversations, all of those things are good for maintaining good cognition. Emotional is about having positive emotions, being able to read emotions in other people. And then thirdly, motivational is about goal setting. So, you know, and continuing to set goals, you know, being part of having a purposeful life is looking ahead and looking forward to things and continuing to plan. A lot of people think that they do retirement planning before they retire, but in fact, they should be continuing to plan throughout retirement. And I was really pleased to see some of the data when we did the polls about just how many people were positive and how holistic their planning had been. And I think that all contributes to a good retirement adjustment.
Could you give me a bit more of a sense of what planning might mean? Say
you're
I don't know, in your early 70s and you've retired a few years before, what sort of planning are you doing then?
I think the planning changes depending upon what stage you are in that sort of process. So we actually did a study with people in retirement villages to see if we could get them to continue to plan more. And where most people actually set goals was around health and social. So, you know, thinking about activities they wanted to engage in or groups that they wanted to connect with or healthy activities that they wanted to do more of. Whereas earlier, you know, pre-retirement planning or early in the retirement phase, people's focus was still on finances. By that stage, they felt they'd had their finances sorted. there wasn't any way to backfill their wealth necessarily. So the focus became different, and it was focused on, social and that rechanging of focus, I think, is realistic. And if people are living in retirement villages, for example, then making new connections is critical. How do you get into groups of people? And it's often from activities like group activities, or playing bridge, for example, is a great one that we hear people doing a lot of, or participating in arts and crafts programs or creative programs of any sort.
Can I come to you, Melody Ding, because you, in your study of the 25,000 older Australians, found that social inequality is critical, and that people with higher education and higher socioeconomic background generally do better. Now, that may be reflected in some of what we've heard tonight in our survey for people who are with us tonight, but just tell us about that and the significance of that for planning before, but also planning during retirement.
Yeah, we know that social inequality really translates into health inequality, and that probably already manifests before retirement. And what our findings show, those who are coming from more advantageous background tend to do better and take advantage of retirement more when it comes to improving healthy lifestyles. And it tend to be less benefits for those who are more from a disadvantaged background. So in a way that we can almost say that after retirement, this inequality, this gap that we're observing pre-retirement might be even bigger. And I think a lot of that might have something to do with, what I really enjoyed kind of hearing about the word resources, because it's not just about wealth. I mean, wealth, we know there's a gap, and the wealth also relate to where people live. For example, do people live in a beautiful neighborhood where they can walk out and there's beautiful parks, there are beaches around that, get you energized and motivated to be physically active, where you can meet friends and socialize easily? Or it's a completely different environment. You walk out and there's highways and there's no safe way to walk. So that is, environmental factors that surrounds the wealth gap. And in the meantime, the resources related to social aspect and health aspect, we cannot just say that, okay, now I'm retired, I'm going to start a full-on fitness program. If you have not had experience with that, if you don't even know where to start, if you don't have the financial resources to see a trainer or sign up for a gym, all of that just become obstacles over time.
And I noticed, Stephen Leeder, that you were nodding then. May I ask why? Because doesn't walking prevent or assist in recovery of everything? Don't we all have to get into groups and walk? Isn't that the fundamental bit of information everybody should take
yes,
away
I suppose so. I'd ask the question, where are you walking to? I mean, seriously, is this the best we can offer the older people? Oh, you've got to go walking for an hour each day. Well, what purpose are we offering?
Well,
You have a dog.
But
then there's a purpose to walking.
I'm sorry?
If you have a dog, then there's a purpose to walking.
Well, that's quite true. And all power to the canine kingdom. But while Melody was speaking, I thought, Will Kanya.
yes. So far western New South Wales town, high Aboriginal population, entrenched in difficult social problems. Why are you mentioning Wilcannia?
Well, I just think, that so much of what we are so privileged to be able to consider with respect to retirement has no application there whatever. For people living in shanty houses with 15 to 20 people in them, no wonder they were eaten by COVID. So no one should disregard the critical importance of external social determinants in setting the agenda. I mean, we can be as assiduous as we like about planning for good health in retirement, but the fact of the matter is, when you retire, you're in an age group where illness is prevalent. And you can have a stroke without any warning whatsoever, or a cancer of some kind.
Yeah.
And everything's thrown into sort of chaos. So we've got to be careful that we don't assign a degree of mastery over circumstance that leads to improved health that's universally applicable, or even among the affluent. This is not so. And we just need to be judicious in our thinking about it. But walking is a wonderful exercise, particularly if you've got a dog, preferably one that's crossed between something and a poodle.
Absolutely.
Or a recycled greyhound. They're also superb. But no, seriously, I think, and there's a lot of fellowship in that. I know I live in Glebe, and if you go for a walk down to Glebe Point in the morning, you'll find a herd of dogs and their owners, all in various forms of social concourse. It's good stuff, and may it proliferate. But there are a lot of people to whom that privilege is simply not available.
Look, thank you. I can see Melody. Come in, Melody.
Yes, because my main research area is physical activity. So that's something that is very close to my heart. And walking is indeed a very healthy form of physical activity. It's low impact, and it doesn't require much of skill training, and is mostly free. And it's the most common physical activity that Australians and, people around the world participate in. So we should never underestimate that. And the other thing I want to emphasize is, because we talk a lot about retirement planning, which I absolutely think is important, and it's never too early to plan, in my opinion. But we also have data showing that even when you change your lifestyle mid-age or even in older age, you still gain from that lifestyle changes. So, even if you retired being inactive, it's still never too late to, put on your runners and go for a walk and try to keep that as a new habit.
Joanne, can I come to you? Because Stephen is obviously bringing a gravitas to this discussion that stops it from being a simple list of tips on retirement and aging. And I think that's really important. And it goes, for me, I'll just offer my comment and I'd ask for your comment, but it goes to, I guess, not being trite about the challenges of such a major transition and the challenges of aging, either that we experience directly ourselves or that close people in our network experience. And, at one point we could respond to Stephen and say, join a multi-generational social group of some kind, grab an oodle derivative, a poodle derivative, and go to the park. I'm not inclined to do that. I want to have some deeper answer. What would you say?
I would say that, part of this, I think there's two issues here. Firstly, one is about expectations and matched expectations. So maybe not having very high expectations in retirement results in something different than if you've got really high expectations about it changing your life. But I think the cure to both of those things is really continuity. And so we try to encourage people to participate in activities prior to retirement, because if you're overlaying too many things simultaneously, it can be challenging. If you're leaving work, and maybe if you're being forced out of work, then you've got to deal with all of that anyway. It's nice to have some things that are still stable and predictable in your lifespan. It's a bit like Melody talked about her neighbour doing dancing, throughout her lifetime. So that sense of continuity. So we encourage people to engage in those types of activities and get them started before they retire, so that they're not trying to do too many things and adjust to too many different transitions at once, just doing things gradually. And that seems to me to be a pretty good recipe for success. And it's something that I've considered in terms of my own retirement as well. So even something like housing, for example, I moved house a couple of years ago, and lots of houses I looked at had a lot of steps. And so I'd look at the house and I'd say to the agent, well, this isn't the house for me, too many steps. And he says, well, you know, you're 54. Isn't it a bit young to be thinking about steps? And I said, not if I don't want to move again in 15 years' time. You know, so it's that sort of continuity, thinking about how you can build those things in, get them out of the way in a way, and then, you know, transition and maintain that continuity.
Stephen, I'll share with you, I've formed a friendship with a 25-year-old girl who's doing a Masters in Classics at the University of Adelaide, and I've joined the Classics Society, which is multi-aged, and I'm planning to do a graduate diploma next year, and I'm going to focus on the emotions in the ancient world, and it's all done through texts, through plays and histories and so on. So in other words, the kind of intellectual pursuits that have excited me all my life, I'm trying to join a multi-generational group that are still doing that. And so a few weeks ago, I went to a nighttime reading of Medea, in which we all sat in a circle and read Medea. And I haven't had such a good time in years. I think there's hope in the poetry. Follow the Stoics. I think there's. But John Piggott, I have to come to you because I know we're approaching the end. And you think the big issue coming down the pipeline for our children, and it may even affect some of us now, is the housing inequality that is occurring. And so many people in our generation are being asked by their children to give big lumps of money, but to the children now to get them into the housing market. But you feel the next generation is going to face extraordinary challenges at retirement if this inequity in housing isn't sorted. Could you just speak to that?
Yeah, I don't want to overplay it, but I think what we're observing, not just as a result of, you know, the last couple of years of house price explosion, but on a longer term basis, is that access to the housing market is hugely helped if you have parents who can give you a hand. And I think you get together with a group of people who are relatively affluent, right, in a meeting around superannuation or something like that. You know, from time to time I do. You know, the bank of mum and dad is a coffee conversation, right? And I'm very conscious when those conversations take place that there is a whole group of people in that younger cohort for whom that access is not available. And I think relative to the past, when the levels of debt that you are required to attach yourself to in order to get into the housing market were much lower. I think that's leading to a sort of bifurcation. And so where historically housing has been a promoter of equality, right? Through the 20th century, gradually more and more people became asset owners, really, as much as through any other means, in fact, more than through any other means, through buying a house for the first time. I mean, it's really the origins of the Australian dream, that idea of equitable access to housing. And I don't have an answer to this. I don't think there are good policies which can somehow reverse the realities that we face. But I do think that down the track, we're going to see more wealth inequality and perhaps more bitter wealth inequality than we have seen in the past. And I do think that's a potential social danger.
When you say bitter, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, I think because home ownership in Australia, this has not been true everywhere, of course, but home ownership in Australia has been relatively high for a long period of time. There was only a relatively small group that didn't own a home in their later years or didn't have housing security in their later years. So I suppose I'm actually talking about, I mean, it's a good question. I suppose I'm actually talking about quantum. So you might be talking about 15, maybe 15%, 20% of the age-eligible population for the pension who are in that group. But in a generation, that might be 30%. I mean, I'm not saying it will be, but you look at the numbers now and you kind of project it forward, and that's not an unrealistic kind of number. And that becomes a much more substantial segment of a cohort. I guess that's what I'm saying, and more vocal, and perhaps, yeah, so bitter mightn't be quite the right word, but a more substantial segment of the population, and a big difference, you know, a big difference, unless we can come up with, I mean, one possibility is to massively extend Commonwealth rent assistance so that those people who find themselves at retirement without a home don't, you know, get twice or three times as much as what we offer now, and that would ameliorate that in some degree. But I think we will need policies like that to address that wealth inequality.
Thank you. I really wanted that put there because I think it's on the minds of many people in retirement right now as they watch their children and their grandchildren. Alan, I think we have time for one last question. Is there something there that you'd give us?
I'll give you first a comment to say thank you to Stephen, because we did from our poll have about 10% of people who'd like to retire but were not in a position to do so. So I think the issue about wealth inequality is certainly part of that. And an unusual question that two people asked is really, I have ageing parents and it's difficult to move them. How do we move them into community living? Because there are going to be a number of older children looking after parents, and we wanting to retire, but we're sort of assisting the living of our older parents. So how can we comment on, you know, how do you retirement plan for that one? Is the question.
Fascinating. Joanne, Earl, can I come to you on that, please?
Sure. I think it is an interesting issue. I don't think I've got any, you know, instant answers, except that I think, you know, getting people used to the idea of respite care in groups. See if we can get social groups together where people might go into respite care together, you know, for an afternoon. So it becomes more of a social event than it does necessarily feeling like, you know, they're going into care. So it feels more of a natural type of transition for people. But it is a difficult question. I think also too, you know, where do you get retirement villages where they can accommodate intergenerational families, essentially, you know, older people in their 70s with parents in their 90s, you know, where do you find retirement villages that will accommodate family groups? Well, not enough of them, I'm afraid, in the same way we don't have low cost and social housing for people on low incomes.
That is is there anyone else on the panel who'd like to comment on that? Because that is such an interesting issue. It's part of our extraordinary success in our health and medical system that people are living so long. You've got, you know, 70-year-olds looking after late 90s. That's what we're talking about, isn't it? Melody, is that something you have a comment on? No, you like to rely on your research, and that is very honourable. But Alan, what about you as a general practitioner yourself? Would you like to comment on that? I always think Montefiore at Randwick will come up with the answer to all these questions. It's
well, you are seeing a number of, you know, again, in better parts of society where you have apartment living as you're getting older, and then you graduate into the aged care facility. And I think a number of the aged care, Anglicare, locally, and not only Montefiore, but we do have that where there is a close proximity to a retirement apartment housing. Vaucluse, there's one, and I'm sure there are others out west. I know there are, out Parramatta Way. So I think that, and again, back to your health issue, you also want to have good medical assistance, and there are a number of GPs who are becoming involved in aged care management because it is a third age of health. In other words, there are different ways to manage older people. Yes, there are geriatricians, but many GPs are sort of becoming part of that support. So if you're going to be retiring to a retirement apartment with a view to retirement village or aged care facility, then I think you need to have a good GP locally and find out that's part of your planning, I guess. Where can I move where I've good health assistance? Because unfortunately, as we get older, we've got more needs and more medicines.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, everyone, I say everyone now because I'm trying to be inclusive of gender fluidity. So ladies and gentlemen and everyone is my new phrase. I wonder, before I hand back to Alan to close, I I personally would like to thank our panel for, I think, a conversation worthy of the challenge of the topic. And I really feel good about that. I'd like to finish, though, with one of the pieces of poetry that Professor Stephen Leeder included in his article that he wrote upon retirement for Medical Observer magazine. And he quotes a little bit from a Turkish poet, Nazim Hikmet, who died in 1963, but was just 61 when he wrote compellingly about some of the existential issues that Stephen has raised. So let me just read it. I mean, you must take living so seriously that even when you are 70, you must plant olive trees, not because you think they will be left to your children, but because you don't believe in death, although you are afraid of it, because I mean, life weighs heavier. I just think, and there's a picture in the article of an olive tree. I think I'm drawn to it because I've moved to Adelaide to be a grandmother, which I'm enjoying immensely, and we have been planting olive trees. So thank you, Stephen, and thank you, everyone. And we'll do our deaf sign clapping for each other if we would. And I'll hand back to Alan for a more formal closing of our meeting.
Yeah, so always a big thank you to Julie. Thank you to our guest panelists, Melody, Joanne, John, Stephen, and to Chris Greiss from National Seniors Australia. I think there's been a wonderful, informative evening. We have answered most of the questions, but there's always more questions to be asked. And so if there are and have been some resources mentioned, they will be available to you on email and on our website as this has been recorded. I asked that any of the attendees tonight, if they could look at our post-webinar email and encourage you to fill in the survey. We do like to hear from you. We do know that the session has been recorded, so it will be available on the Wolper website in the coming week. Our next Wellbeing evening will be the last one for the year, is on Wednesday, 8th of December. It's on the gut microbiome. This is the new world of gut knowledge and what it is and why is it crucial to our good health and well-being. So I thank you all. Hey, go ahead.
Alan, just before we close, if I could just ask Chris Greiss, he's still with us there on the screen. Would you like to make a final comment? Chris, we've got a minute or two and then we'll do a formal close.
Yeah, I'd just like to quickly reflect on that last question in particular, is that the challenges, I guess, in terms of this intergenerational transfer, there's roles to be played by, for example, council and town planning. And insofar as that there are so many restrictions in place to enable people to actually age in place with different generations of family. Very difficult to put in granny flats and things of that nature. And also, just as a last point, I think that maybe we can take inspiration as far as those cohesive groups, as far as different generations living together, from our cultural and linguistically diverse communities. And we've seen, during COVID, how, in particular, they have come together as these units of strength and support. And I think that maybe we can take some inspiration and guidance in terms of what they're doing to make it work, I suppose.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks.
Alan, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I want to say thank you again and wish everybody all the best and hope to see you with Julie again on Wednesday, the 8th of December. So have a good night, and certainly if you're not vaccinated, be vaccinated and all stay well. Have a good night to everybody, and thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're now going to formally end our webinar this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.